Welcome everyone to the third CML Career Talk. Today we have Ian Terry, who is a UX researcher and also founder of his own company. So he'll like the previous talks, he'll talk about his career journey from kind of after, graduating from undergrad to now, and maybe one or two of his most favorite projects that he's worked on throughout his career. Ian, yeah, take it away.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think actually there's going to be two things that it will be kind of probably different about my journey than some probably the previous two. Kind of starting with that my career journey started when I was 5 years old. I was diagnosed with a rare disease called pseudoxanthoma elasticum that we were told was deadly, and I would be dead by the time I was 13. I'm turning 36 in 3 days. So that very clearly wasn't true. But it kicked off my family founding an organization called PXC International, which studies the rare disease, and my involvement in that organization since I was a little kid. So, um, as Michael and I were just talking about earlier, careers are not linear. So the path from being diagnosed to where I am today in health research and everything was not direct, which is kind of going to be the second part of my story for career wise. But it very much had a formative impact on what I do, how I do it, where I come from, and the views that I've taken to get where I am today. Um, my my career, which is I work in specifically today these days, I work in health tech and health operations from a UX side, yes, but also from a full stack development side. And so that early experience was much more foundational for the UX side. I was traveling around with my family doing research and talking to individuals and learning their experiences and helping integrate that into our research and into our processes, which is of course very foundational to true UX, right? Not methods dependent, but human dependent, and sitting with people and talking to them directly. And maybe over the years since I've learned how to do that better from a methodological standpoint. But in those early years, it was the foundation for um, looking at personal, individual, idiomatic experience and then turning that into insights we could use. I went to University of Maryland, for linguistics and physics, so completely opposite end of the spectrum of where I am today. Uh, I actually did not end up graduating. I started my own company in web development, which wasn't actually the intention. I was kind of a uh, rebellious 19-year-old that wanted to never work a day in my life. And I'd been told if you never want to work, do something you love. So I started trying to teach music and art with a delivery service, basically. Um, I didn't have enough money to start the company, so I built the website myself, and then found out very rapidly that nobody really wanted music or art classes from someone that didn't have any credentials in music and art and just could play the guitar. But everybody wanted websites, and the proof was in the pudding that the website worked. So I spent the next few years kind of floating around as a freelance web developer, um, and started implementing the UX stuff from my younger years in an unofficial capacity, right? It just kind of started happening that I would talk to people the way that I talk to people and interact with people and see their lives and start building those web protocols better and better using that. Um, I then, in about 2012, 2013, discovered that user experience was actually a thing that had a name and a process and could be done. So I joined several UX communities and started working directly under the tutelage of Rolf Malik, who is, if people are not as UX educated, was one of the individuals that set up the usability heuristics in the Malik and Nielsen era. Um, I spent several years under his both direct and indirect tutelage, getting my certifications from ISQI and AP and not APHA. Well, that was Michael and I were talking about that earlier. That we'll come back around to that. But the UX, CPUX, the general certificates in UX, um, and in about 2015, after spending that time doing that, I started back into the health world. So I had been doing web development. I got more into UX. And then it kind of dawned on me one day that the product of health was the outcomes in health research, and that of course UX could be used in health, and that no one had really been doing that yet. That UX had all these absolutely, incredible processes that were incredibly well validated, but everyone was using them to, move a button on a screen, not improve outcomes for people's health and people's livelihoods and that sort of thing. So I moved into working with a company called Private Access, which was working on health registries, but was doing it in a very un-UX way. Like if I could show the outputs of some of their systems, even to this day, we're in 2025, so this is a decade after I was working with them, I am still dealing with the fallouts of how bad their user experience system was for specifically their outputs. We got health data out from the system that the instead of the rows uh, being questions and the no, sorry, the columns being questions and the rows being people. The columns were people and the rows were questions with sub questions divided into subsections and not even named the name of the question. It was like question 70065 001, 70065 002. And each one of those secondary ones was the row of the matrix, was its own row in the thing. So there are some that go up to dash 87, and it's like
I'm getting shivers just
the
hearing the description of like, yeah.
yes. And every single one of the answers was a scale. So even if the person said yes, it was a 7. If they said no, it was a 9. If they didn't answer, it was a 3. Like the whole thing was just as bad as you can imagine from a UX perspective. So I spent about 4 years working inside Private Access, trying to fix all of the errors there. Um, and like Michael and I were discussing right before we started the call, and I've said a few times, everything is not linear. So Private Access failed. The funders pulled, the organization started falling apart, the patents weren't panning out. And this is going to become a theme in this little story. Um, and I converted back into being a web developer when Private Access went under, but bringing all of that knowledge with me. So I kind of took what looked like from my career perspective to be a step backwards, just started building websites again. I went completely freelance and founded my own little company called Aretetic Solutions, which at first was literally just a web development company. We didn't do anything else. I built websites for, a company called Say Hello Closets and Direct Auto Part, not Direct Auto Parts.com, and things like that, where it was not glamorous at all. It was just paying the bills. Um, I got a contract for some UX research for a small startup company called Luna DNA in 2019, which ended up being the foundations for a process that I began to form, that has led to the IP that I founded, well, not even founded, brought back to my own company for. So I did a freelance contract for them where I was looking at what do advocacy groups, industry groups, and participants see in the linguistic structures of how you might interact on a registry basis. So what are the languages that industry is using? What is the languages that advocacy is using and what are the languages that participants use around health research, and how does that affect the information architecture and the inability to work together? Because a lot of the times, whenever you bring industry and advocacy together specifically, they all seem like they're really happy with each other and they all powwow and then walk away, and then the study falls apart and nothing happens. Um, and this was another major impetus for me for the fact that we could use more UX research processes on this sort of thing. So I started using things like the top tasks theory from Jerry McGovern, started using contextual interview structures. So going into the meetings with the advocacy and industry groups rather than asking them about it, and watching the interviews take place and doing more in situ environment studies and ethnographies around these things. That contract led to Luna DNA hiring me directly, just as I've been hired into private access, and 5 years of working on another registry solution, which is actually where I met Michael, um, that we were now trying to do participant enabled research on this aspect. So I'd kind of come full circle and was back in another registry after about 3 years of being out of it, working on the UX on this side. The UX was much better here. The outputs from Luna that I have today that I still use with the private access stuff at least have the participants as rows, and the questions are standard English. So you can actually just search and say like eyes and get a response. Um, the work there was very good, but it was far more product focused than UX focused. I honestly didn't end up doing that much UX research. I did more product modeling, product design, product ownership, that sort of thing, with kind of UX as the backdrop to my own product things. I was both a UX team and a product team, which, as anyone who's ever done it knows, does not work super well because then you're constantly doing UX research to catch up to yourself rather than lead yourself in any real way, which is really the place that it shines. The fact that I was a UX researcher means that at least I got to prioritize it. So while it was catch up UX research, it was still always done, which was a major benefit, which was not true in private access. I had more autonomy and more power and more ability to make the stuff happen in Luna, especially towards the end. I was the head of product and the head of UX research there at Luna. In 2024, a little bit over a year ago, Luna also closed. And the collapse of the company was really quick. So from all of my experience, it was the most, and again, this is where things are not linear in a career path. It was probably the most traumatic and the scariest thing. It was December 20th, 2023, and we got contacts from our VP of strategy and operations and said the company will be closing on February 2nd, 2024. You have a month and 10 days to figure out what you're going to be doing. Um, I, as happens in my career, I immediately pulled back and thought, okay, I'll go back to web development because that's where I know I can pull things in. Um, but this time around, a bunch of the registries that I'd been working with, because I'd been so involved in the product development and not just the UX research, um, were Luna clients that immediately came forward and said that they needed a solution to their problem. Now, again, because of all that background in UX and all that, when you hear I have a problem and you've been inside the solution for it, the immediate thing that I thought was I can fix it, right? And that is the real foundation for a company, right? Not VCs, not anything else. It's having a real life problem in front of you and people sitting in front of you with money saying I can pay for the problem solution and you've got it. So Luna was gracious enough to give me back all the IP I had developed underneath them. And I incorporated it back into that company that I had founded when private access failed, Aretetic Solutions. And we built a product in less than a month that we called Digital Cabinet, which was literally just a place that was safe enough to store health data that was being forced to be removed from Luna because Luna said they would delete all the data on February 4th. So between January 3rd and February 4th, I built a new solution to store the data as fast as I possibly could, and then immediately offered it to all these different companies. And we got our startup costs covered by being the data scientists to extract all the data and then move it into the storage location that everyone paid for. So by February 4th, 2024, we were revenue net positive, which was not something that had ever happened to me before or I'd ever seen happen before. Um, and since then, we have been building out, based off of that customer funding, we've been building out a registry solution that I now own and operate. So my background is still very much UX research, but my day to day these days is operation executive and chief technical officer for the building of that registry solution. And that's kind of where I am now, which again was never something that I thought would be where I am. The executive of a health registry company when it's not something I even really want to be doing. But we had the customers, we had the experience, we had the knowledge, and we had the structures to do it. Um, and now we're focusing, really our main focus is on uh, being the champions of those UX processes, becoming actual usable products for these organizations. So rather than trying to use the US processes anymore, we're turning those processes into products so that people can use them themselves. They can set up contextual interviews asynchronously with their populations, and then use natural language processing and other things to extract insights automatically and then deliver them back to the population so that we can kind of automate the um, the impact that UX should be having on health and participation, but instead requires far too much capital for most of these smaller organizations to do.
Nice. Yeah. Thanks for that very comprehensive overview, Ian. I have some questions. I guess maybe kind of to start, could you give maybe like a little like high level summary of kind of what Luna like what was doing? And then a follow-up question, because I guess you ended up taking their registry and then kind of continuing with it. Is it kind of the same general model where like the people in Luna's base, like in your base now, is it like are they still choosing like which scientists get their data and analyze it, or is it the same model, or is it a little different? Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of there. So Luna specifically was a very novel company in its concept. It's one of the reasons I joined them after um, I'd already been through it all with private access. Luna had a special filing with the SEC that allowed them to a novel interpretation of data as money. So when someone joined the Luna platform, when they added their data into the platform, they actually gained shares of ownership in the company. The SEC saw it as actual purchasing of shares of ownership. Um, that was a really interesting idea in concept that caused a lot of problems in practice. There was SEC blackout periods. There was a massive behind the scenes thing that I doubt you ever saw, Michael, which was this giant chart of what data was worth from a monetary perspective and how to break it down and which types of data were worth what and what was the maximum value of any type of data. And all of that calculation had to be taking place all the time. And it put this massive overhead on top of Luna. So when Luna closed, before Luna closed, one of Luna's visions was get enough people, get enough scale, and uh, pharma will pay for the operations, right? So make it free for advocacy and participation and get enough people, and pharma will pay for it. It's the kind of like the Facebook model, right? Get enough people, get enough attention, and someone else with a lot of money will pay for it. That requires a lot of VC overhead, right? You have to have a lot. I think Luna had something like $20 million invested in it or something like that before the end. Um, and that's not a huge amount for a startup, but that's a heck of a lot more than I have. Right. Um, and so when it closed and when we got everything back, that was not on the table, right? There was no we can scale this and do the startup thing. Instead, we need to do this in a way that provides value to the individual customer who's purchasing this right here. And the other thing that that impacts for me is that I think when you bring in VC money, you inherently get a perverse incentive, right? It is no longer about producing the product. That might be true for the people on the ground like me who were trying to produce the product. But for the people who are pulling the strings in the back end, it's how is my exit? Right? How much money can this make me? And as soon as it doesn't start looking like it's going to produce the money, people start pulling out and the company starts faltering, which is what was happening to Luna over the last few years, right? We had to suddenly start redirecting into different and more valued areas so that the investors would continue to invest, not so that the users would continue to use it. Um, the other thing that Luna did is it said that data would never leave the platform, right? Because one of the things about ownership of data is that if these individuals own their data, and they do, according to the SEC filing, they have legal and financial ownership of their data, which gave them legal and financial ownership of the company. If that data ever left the platform, that can't be enforced, right? If I were able to download someone's data, I can now run over to my neighbor's house and put it on their computer, and then run to their neighbor's house and put it on their computer. And so this concept of what's called keeping a string on the data completely fell apart if the data left the platform. So Luna basically said all data needs to stay on the platform. That was another major issue from their data structure because who wants to never extract the data, right? The whole point of data collection is to extract it, analyze it, and do things with it. And if you can only do it in one environment, in one language, you're majorly limiting the capacity for people to work with you. The number of people that we got who came forward who were like, I need to do this in SAS. And we were like, well, we don't support SAS. And they were like, well, goodbye, right? We
Yeah,
don't
I have
know
firsthand
R.
experience with that too. Trying to,
Yeah, right.
yeah.
Um, Jupyter notebooks only. If you've never used them, good luck,
Yeah,
right?
Python or bust. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So those flaws were something that, again, this is where failing, when I was younger, I was like, why do people give so much money to people who have failed multiple times at companies? But failing at companies is probably the best lesson for the things that actually make it so a company can work or not, right? Those failures from private access, those failures from Luna, almost they informed the creation of Digital Cabinet more than anything else that I've ever done, right? All my years of training in UX were like this, and then failures at private access and Luna for my decision making. So while we still have the participants own their data, we instead took a majorly GDPR informed perspective on how data ownership works and how data pipelines work. So participants own their data, flat, clear. That's never going to change, right? GDPR basically says that the data subject is the data owner. Those are the one and the same, and that person can do whatever they want to do with their data. Um, GDPR also states, though, that there are uh, data controllers, data managers, and data processors. So essentially, Aretetic has positioned Digital Cabinet so that we are a data manager and a data processor. We don't control the data in any way. We don't own the data in any way. We don't do any of that stuff. We process data based on participants' consents. So if a participant consents to a person seeing their data, we process the data into a form that that person can see, de-identified, aggregated, all that stuff. The data controller is the person who has requested the processing, and they also become the data owner for the processed data. So we literally just stand in that middle ground between giving participants ownership and control, and then the sponsoring parties their process data outputs. And they can download it directly and do whatever the heck they want with it and get it in CSV form and all that stuff, while keeping it so that the individual can opt back out at any time and delete their data from said pipelines. And that's kind of where we also, the major difference that we've done as well is Luna was entirely AWS. We own all of our own data centers. So right outside here, there's a HIPAA compliant, HIPAA and GDPR compliant shed. Literally just was a shed uh, that I put some locks on, and there's a server inside of it. We have one in Ireland and we have one in Canada as well, so that we can do data residency.
Wow. The locks on the shed are required for HIPAA compliance. Is that okay?
Yeah, oh yeah, you have to have physical, what is it from CSSP? You have to have physical, digital, environmental, and behavioral security levels in
Wow.
order to be HIPAA compliant. Yeah.
That's cool. Interesting. Yeah, thanks for that additional information. So also, you've mentioned that you've developed your own methodology and, specifically CDI. And I know it's proprietary, but maybe could you kind of go a little background of just whatever you can kind of mention for the public about the process and kind of how it also builds off of like more traditional
Yep.
qualitative methodologies. Yeah.
Yeah, so that specifically is the thing that I started back when I was first joining Luna, and that was the IP that Luna gave back to me when the company closed. CDI, as Michael just said, stands for Community-Driven Innovation. It is the concept that in health research, a lot of the times studies are predetermined. So an individual comes to a group of people and says, excuse me, I'm studying, sleep disturbances in children with epilepsy, and these are the questions I'm going to ask. We have to do that in health research because we need to IRB review what the human subject is going to go through. So we need to know the questions that are being asked, who they're being asked to, how they're going to be asked, how that person's going to be onboarded, how the results are going to be returned to them, all that information. It's really important, especially in certain communities. There have been really awful things that happened in the past. Like there was a study conducted by the VA on sexual trauma in veterans that they initiated by calling veterans directly and saying, since you've reported sexual trauma, we have selected you. And it was this loud voice that was on the phone. And so veterans that answered their phone on speakerphone because, hey, it's just a call from the VA, were suddenly having their entire family informed that they had sexual trauma while being a veteran and maybe had never told their families that before. Um, and so there was a whole swath of suicides after that happened.
Oh my God.
Um, so health research is very much required to know who are you talking to, how are you talking to them, and that sort of thing. Contacting pregnant women, maybe parts of their family don't know they're pregnant, all that sort of stuff. Um, so because of that structure, health research is boxed. And so boxed that most research has nothing to do with the actual priorities that people have. When you look at health research that was, okay, I was going to say is funded by the NIH, was funded by the NIH, not anymore, thanks to the modern environment, um, on, let's say, women, right? Uh, Almost none of that money is spent on priorities that, if you actually talk to women, are important. They're spending almost all of the money on breast cancer, which 20 years ago, women said was very important. These days, when you actually do UX research processes, and I can talk about CDI and how we implemented that into that, women say that irregular menstruation, the cost of taking care of their menstrual health, general breast health, not just um, breast cancer, all of that sort of stuff is actually higher in priority than breast cancer is, because breast cancer has had so much research that it's actually much lower down on the scales these days. But nothing has been done to update that because everyone comes with their pre-decided questions and their studies that have already been approved, and they just keep doing the same stuff over and over again. So we developed CDI out of contextual interviews, something called Arrow's impossibility theorem, which basically stated that decision making was time bound. And we kind of invalidated that time bound nature of decision making and saying that we can actually break the time bound aspect of Arrows and Possibility Theorem and start looking at decision making as an iterative thing over time. And then also incorporated things like card sorting and other UX aggregate decision making processes to make it so that we could have a living, breathing data set of priority that we could build the IRB approval off of. So rather than asking, we're going to ask these questions and telling the IRB or that, we said, hey, IRB, we're going to ask people what's important to them. We're going to evaluate their responsive in this way, and then we are going to generate question sets based off of their priority structures this way, and then we're going to ask them the questions. So basically, we built a system for the participants to build their own studies. And then the IRB says, okay, we can't really say that you can't ask someone questions they have asked you to ask them.
Mhm.
And that gets around the boxed in nature of an IRB. As long as, of course, we do it in, we're not calling people on speakerphone. We're not emailing them the results of their own studies. We're doing it inside of a contained, identifiable, verifiable, authenticated platform, and all of that basic stuff. So we have, proper authentication. We've got proper identity verification. We don't email things over email. People have to log into the platform to get notifications. All those basic standard stuff, AES 256 encryption, all the things that is required. And then we can layer on top those UX research processes and give people the power to design their own studies. Um, and even some stuff that less UX, but these days also comes out of computational social choice, where we have things like quadratic voting and other mechanisms like that are coming out of academia, that we have started implementing as additional processes on top of the CDI results, so that now the individuals can actually allocate money to fund their own studies that they designed themselves. So we're actually even getting out of the place of having a PI or a funder at all. The individuals are coming in and saying, I'm giving $5 and I'd like you to study, the irregular menstruation from our women's health group, or texting, right, was a big thing actually that came up in physical functioning for cancer patients. No one's studying texting, right? Fine motor motion. And these cancer patients who can't get out of bed, who are feeling very sick, also can't move their fingers very well. So they are cut off from all forms of communication for months on end. And no one's researching it, no one's studying it. So our cancer community actually brought that up as a need in their CDI and then funded studies on it themselves to try and build a better way to then be able to communicate, or at least study how to improve said communication.
Yeah, yeah, I think CDI is super cool, and I also think it's great in that it like provides this alternative source for a way to formulate hypotheses that are kind of like outside of the established literature, and for the reasons that you kind of already kind of touched on of like, for like on some cases, like yes, the established literature can be useful and some insightful, but there is a lot of institutional elements and other kind of factors that kind of create a little bit of a silo, versus just kind of asking people directly, just kind of like, hey, like what's important to you, and then like let's then create a more follow-up study based off of that. So yeah, no, I think that's
Yep.
great. And I have some more questions, but I kind of want to open it up first before I don't want to like dominate the Q&A. Yeah, in case anyone else has anything. But if not, I could also just yeah, okay, yeah.
It's been fascinating to listen to. It's really, really interesting. I love the framework and sort of approaching. I also do a lot of UX research, and so I sort of approach things. I try to approach things non-traditionally, and one thing I observe is sometimes you receive pushback for looking at things differently. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. You're coming in this with a different perspective, and I'm wondering, what has the reception been, and has it always been positive? And how do you handle those conversations?
Yeah. Yeah. The reception has been good on the most part. It has not always been positive. And even saying it has been good on the most part does not mean uh, how to put it. And I'm sure you've experienced this too, where you get, oh, that's really interesting, and I can see why that works, and that's wonderful, and we should do it that way. And then they don't, right? Um, and this is something for UX careers in general that I think is something that always comes up is that the language that people use and the way they interact with UX is very um, hand wavy and performative. And that has been very much the way that this has been received, right? So we get a lot of, that's awesome. That's amazing. It should definitely be done that way. The next year, that's awesome. That's amazing. It should definitely be done that way until you kind of feel like you're losing your mind at the Precision Medicine World Conference for the sixth year in a row, saying the same things, getting the same responses, and nothing changes. Um, and so a big thing that we've definitely been doing is we have not been trying to change people's minds. This is something that I definitely had to learn in my UX career and in my career in general, is that especially in UX training, we are taught that the goal is to provide evidence to stakeholders and help change their perspective so the user is represented. In my experience, that will never work. If the person does not view the user as the if the stakeholder does not view the user as the purpose of the product, you will never change their mind. So what we've been doing and why I was more empowered at Luna than I was at Private Access is Private Access viewed their user as their patents and themselves. They were one of those companies that was working for IP. Uh, that means that the user will never be useful. This is data points. It's hand waving completely. Luna at least was viewing the user as a means to an end, and for some of Luna's people as the main point. And so we had this kind of halfway baked UX maturity, right? Where like for some of the company, UX mattered, for some of it, it didn't. So providing them this UX research results was useful. Since we've gotten to be our own company, we basically do this UX maturity evaluation where like we will talk to anyone who wants to work with us. If we have to convince you of the need for this, I'm not working with you. We are just, and that is kind of a superpower of as soon as you start funding your work through customers, you don't have to work with anyone. You know, the day that as a company we turned down a $1.2 million deal, the company came with it and said, "This is it. We want to work with you." And we were like, "We're happy that you want to. We don't." Was a really interesting moment for me because of course, $1.2 million for a small company means that I'd be able to hire more people and develop faster and do more things. But the amount of energy that needs to be spent on convincing people of something that should be table stakes at this point is just not worth it to me anymore. So we get a lot of bad responses, and even if they're hand wavy and they're not bad, we do get some where that's like, well, people's biases are always going to fuck up what you're doing, so don't talk to people, right? The experts know more, and it's like, well, yeah, the experts are just as biased as the people. um, um, but as soon as we see those red flags, basically, we cut the relationships and I would much rather take a $20,000 contract with a really small company that believes the right thing than take a $1 million contract with a really big company that doesn't.
Yeah.
That's
That's
awesome. That's great.
yeah. Yeah. And that's a resonant point for me in that like I just kind of started my own company a couple months ago, and that kind of even picking and choosing the clients and work, and especially kind of in the beginning it's like hard to say no to money. Yeah, yeah. And it's like, where, and by like that kind of cost benefit analysis of like, even if this would be like monetarily beneficial, if it does create a lot of more work or stress, and your heart's not into it and you're not aligned with it, then it does kind of like really beg the question of like, is this worth doing? So yeah.
Yep. Yep.
If you guys can say no to 1.2 million, that gives me confident that I can at least for my much, much, much smaller amount of money that yeah, it's coming my way.
Yeah. I mean, it to be honest, it's kind of one of those things of like once you start to say no, the our revenue went up massively once we started to say no. It did not go up like that when we were saying yes, because we kept getting stuck into these contracts and these times that like we're sucking energy, we're sucking time, we were developing things that didn't help our overall mission. And so our product fragmented, right? And with a fragmented product, it's kind of like, the early UX analogy of like if someone tells you they need to get from point A to point B, don't build them a motorcycle, build them a skateboard, right? Um, we in the beginning, we were using the UX mentality. We were building a minimum viable product. I even hate that one. We were building a minimum lovable product, right? Something small, but it worked. Um, but we were building multiple minimum lovable products for multiple people because we were being pulled in all these different directions because we just kept saying yes. And our instead of ending up with a skateboard, we ended up with like three tricycles. No, tricycle's the wrong word. Three unicycles. So they worked, but you had to be a very skilled user, and it didn't feel whole, right? It didn't feel usable unless you were majorly trained. As soon as we started saying no, we kind of got this superpower of being able to say yes to the ones that would only move us forward in the direction that we knew the product needed to move forward, right? So we got to start saying yes to someone who came to us with a need and a problem that our UX research had already shown us existed and we wanted to solve. And then every time we completed a project, we got to go back to old customers and say, we have this new feature to the thing that you were doing. And they were saying, oh, we actually just started getting that problem because they had moved to the previous problem that was connected. And so we were building this because we were only saying yes to ones that were really specific. We were building the next phase of the product funded by a customer. And it became this holistic story that our revenue just like absolutely exploded.
That's really cool. And I think it also touches on the fact that like a lot of people don't know exactly what they want too. So it's kind of like if you're staying true to your mission and kind of your focus, then like you can then develop the things that you think are worthwhile and then retroactively, be like, oh, hey, by the way. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, I love that. Yeah, definitely a lot of inspiration for my own stuff. Definitely I'm taking notes on that. So I do have about, I think, two more questions. I know we're like probably about like 15 minutes left. So I guess this question relates kind of more towards like the healthcare UX side of things in the sense of like, if you're doing, interviews or kind of one-on-ones or even group, sessions with, patients or people who are if impacted by, healthcare issues, um, you know, how do you kind of deal with the balance between like as a researcher you want to be analytical, you want to be able to be observant and being able to have a little bit of distance so you can kind of see these larger patterns, but also kind of deal with the fact that you are kind of hearing someone maybe even spill their guts on like very personal, very intimate situations that could even have caused them a lot of trauma. So kind of how do you kind of
Hmm.
go with that balancing act versus maybe other UX applications where if it's just like, shoes or, lipstick, it's a lot less emotional. I mean, there is probably emotion
Yeah.
with those too, but, not as the same way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. That's a very interesting question. Um, Partly because, hmm. So 100%, I've done UX on websites, I've done UX on alcohol sales, I've done it on developments of I'm a producer for a YouTube channel that I also moonlight with the UX there because they don't have a bunch of money, right? Like so I do this in a bunch of different places. And it's 100% true that they all contain emotions and they all contain trauma, right? No matter what, humans are trauma informed. So everywhere we go, there is some level of emotion and some level of trauma, even talking to someone about their shoes, right? The One of the most formative moments for me when I was doing some UX research for a shoe store in DC, and it turned out that everyone was buying new shoes at this shoe store when it was raining because they were ruining their shoes because they'd forgotten their umbrella and their shoes were soaked and they needed a new pair because they had a meeting that afternoon and didn't want to be completely soaked. And so the main driver for the purchasing of new shoes was a physical trauma that was driving them, and this emotional fear that their boss was going to be upset that they're looking like a sagging wet sack of block when they're supposed to be giving a presentation, right? So there's that in everything, right? The difference is that in health, there's a really famous quote from Derek Featherstone, at least in the health UX world, that when you're designing accessibility in health or in anything, you're not designing for someone else. You're designing for yourself in the future, right? Because every single one of us will at some point have a health crisis. By the time we're 70 years old, 95% of the population has had one, at least one major health crisis. So at some point in your life, you will be the sick person, period. I have a greater connection to that because I was the sick person at 5. So health research is simultaneously more in my bones, but also much closer to my own personal traumas. So there is a degree of almost a crossover with medical practitioners and what they need to do, right? You will learn when you're getting ready for medical work, you will learn about bedside manner, you'll learn about compassion fatigue, you'll learn about all these things that most people never talk about. That once you start doing UX research in the health world, you have to start studying because you start encountering it on instead of like a medical practitioner where it's a different person every day and so different traumas every day, you're getting very interactive and very engrossed with families for a long period of time that are having things happen to them that might be very close to home. I remember early 2020, I was working with a rare disease group. No, no, sorry, early 2022. I was working with a rare. Oh, you helped me with this one, Michael.
Yeah,
Um,
like sounds familiar. Is
a,
that
AGSAA. They had children that were totally fine. They were born fine. They looked fine. They moved fine. And then suddenly, around 2 to 3 years old, they started regressing and regressing massively. My daughter was born in 2017. So when I was interacting with these groups, she was between 4 and 5 years old. And some of these children were 4 to 5 years old and regressed to 6 months old. And I distinctly remember having phone calls with them, talking to them, putting on the bedside manner, doing everything you're supposed to do to make them feel calm, to make them feel like you're listening, to make them feel like you're empathetic, all that stuff, but not involving yourself, right? You can't involve yourself in this sort of research or you're going to invalidate it, right? I can't be like, "Oh yeah, man, that makes me think of my daughter," right? Because now I'm invalidating the research. So putting on all the face, getting off the call and just breaking down in tears and going and hugging my daughter and having to realize that I couldn't do these studies repeatedly, right? Realizing that in this space in UX, you have to build in times for activity and times for like on and off times. You have to build it almost like you're building deployments for military men, which was like the weirdest thing for me to start realizing that like the closest representation was like you're in essentially a combat zone, trauma wise, that every moment of every day when you're spending 8 hours a day talking to families in trauma is vicarious trauma, every single one of them, which also then led me to some of the research that has been done on police officers because they also experience really high loads of vicarious trauma by just witnessing all these horrible things that are happening to people. And you're at least in the health UX research world, you're slightly removed, right? Like you're not the one who gets the phone call when the kid dies, right? But you're the next day talking to the mother whose child has just died, um, or watching on the phone as an infant vomits blood because they have translaterals through their lungs. And the parents responding with, oh, this happens all the time. So you get this even secondary level of vicarious trauma where they're responding to it like it's an everyday event. And to you, it's horrible. And you can't process that. So, one of the major aspects of health UX research to me is finding a support system uh, and not viewing it like it is product research, right? It is product research, but the product is a human and you are one. So you are going to be empathetic and it is going to hurt and not assuming that it's not going to.
Yeah, no, that's a great insight. And I think especially like, yeah, kind of taking the same mindset as what you said, like as a doctor or a therapist, or just like where you kind of have to be very honest of like, oh, this is emotionally impactful, and then to plan accordingly instead of just like, yeah, pretending that it's not, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's very interesting application for sure. And so I guess the final question I have, unless there's any other questions. All good. Okay, I just want to check before. Yeah, yeah. But so I asked this question for pretty much everyone at the end. If you could kind of, go into a time machine and talk to your younger self, right in the beginning of your career, what is some kind of advice from your, older Ian would say to your younger self?
Uh, I actually, this one's pretty easy for me because I say it to myself constantly these days, even that the, I guess, of mice and men, right? That like every plan we make is not a plan. The map is not the terrain. You are laying out your vision, but it is not going to equal that ever, ever. It's not even like sometimes not going to happen. It will not happen, period. Don't expect it to, don't want it to. But lay out plans so that you can start understanding the patterns that happen in the disruptions and start to understand, at least for me, that the lateral learning, which is what I've been referring to it as, I know that's a kind of an obscure, an esoteric idea, but that the learning we get between the moments when we think we're improving is far more important than the goals or the actual quote unquote depth of learning. And not to move away from the depth of learning, like learn your facts, learn your structures, learn your processes, but the in-betweens matter so much more, right? Like the things that have made my company successful is not my studying under Rolf Malik, is not my years of web development, is not the fact that I've been spending 10 years that I spent 10 years developing in React. Those are all awesome and they help. But the thing that is making my company successful is the in between those pieces, all of the interactions between them. I love Irish mythology. I'm heavily into mythological stuff, and there's a wonderful story in Irish mythology called Lugh and the Teotha de Danann, where basically it's the story of a guy who believes he should be a god. That's pretty often in Irish mythology that people think they should be a god. So in modern sense, that sounds weird, but to them, that's just like, yeah, most people think they should become divinity. Um, and he goes to the gates of becoming a god and says, they go, why should we let you in? And he says, well, I'm a blacksmith. And they go, great, we have a blacksmith. And he goes, okay, I'm a poet. And they go, great, we have a poet. And he goes, I'm a sheep herder. And they go, great, we have a sheep herder. And he keeps doing this for days. The story takes place over like a week of him just saying more things until finally the gatekeeper goes inside and is like, there's this guy out here who says he's all these things, but we already have all these things. And the current king of the deity says, well, yeah, but we don't have someone who can do every single one of them at the same time. And so they let him in, and he actually becomes the king of all the gods. And his name becomes Samaldanach, which means the holder of all, or the one in many, in the many in one hand. And the idea to me being that it is actually more important to fuse together disparate things and to be okay with our path being circuitous and not viewing that as getting off of the path, but instead viewing it like you're following the ripples and the hills and the shape of space time or however you want to view it to arrive at actually where you were supposed to be the entire time.
That's really great. And I think especially for a field like user experience research where like I mean I guess it's not as new as it was like maybe like 10, 20 years ago, but it still kind of has this kind of like and there is even now formal programs in it, but there is still kind of this sense of like people with a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different experiences, but then kind of stitching them together into this kind of more coherent, entity. And so, yeah, I think that's a
Yeah.
great sentiment. And yeah, really great way to, end today's talk. So yeah, so thanks, Ian, for coming and joining us today. It's been really interesting, like as always, to hear you, talk about your past experiences and just your thoughts on all these other different issues. So yeah, yeah, yeah. Thanks again. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.